All right, let's get back together here. Turn to the book of Job. So, what makes these wisdom books come alive, I think, is to think of them as almost radical examples. Think of the impact that a book of like Song of Solomon would have had in the kingdom of Israel, at some time that, they were dealing with, very relevant issues, and for the audiences that were receiving them, it would have been revolutionary for them to apply these things to their life and be invited to do these things. So, answering the big questions: what's the moral value of life? Ecclesiastes. How do I celebrate romance in the proper context of a love relationship? In this book that we're looking at now, Job, is this question that asks and deals with, why do these bad things happen to good people? It's really not so much the question that Job's asking, though. I'm going to ask the question. I think the proper question that the book Job asks is, why do the righteous suffer? It's a different kind of question. Or not, so it's not quite accurate to say, why do bad things happen to good people? But why do the righteous suffer? So this, again, becomes another very practical book for us to look at, and a very relevant question that the world is asking. In that very question, why do these, talk about suffering? How often does this intersect your all's ministries? And in what ways? What ways do you see that issue of suffering? People that come to you and are, that they're in the middle of something that's causing them pain. Various kinds of pain, physical pain, emotional pain. Does that ever happen in your ministry? Yeah? Talk about it. All the time? Yeah. It's very common, isn't it? People outside of our churches, by the way, are asking that same kind of question. Because life happens to them too. So, merely for the apologetical value, this is kind of a book that's very relevant for us, as we can get at culture and help culture understand those outside the church. Well, how do you Christians respond? And some of this, as we'll see, gets into the very question and nature of who God is, to a world that's, a little bit confused about that. They haven't had systematic theology. They don't know all the categories of who God is and his person. So it's a very comprehensive book. My constant reminder of this is the typical share prayer request time, especially at my choir. There's some older people who are in the choir that I participate in, and sometimes life challenges, illness especially, struggles with heart problems or cancer, or those are the kinds of things that typically ail older people. And when you have a higher concentration of older people who know older people, guess what the prayer requests become? There's a long list of you get to the end and it's like, is there anything good happening out there? It's a challenge, when all you hear about is the bad and the suffering and people who have cancer and people who are struggling with finances and, But it also overlaps with the world headlines, the headlines that we read about, things going on in the world out there. There's suffering, questions of injustice overlaps with this book, right? In the imbalance of resources in the world, things like that. And then God's role. We're going to see God's role kind of come into the book of Job. So with great fear and trembling, we move ahead to the book of Job. Another hard book to translate and get your mind and heart around. There's our deep thought picture. But it's an interesting picture because I think it illustrates really well what the book of Job unveils with regards to the one who's righteous. When we meet up with Job, we learn about him. Not sinlessly perfect, but he's righteously in right relationship with God, the creator and sovereign of the universe. And there are his hands. So in the midst of the suffering that Job experiences, guess where God is? He's not removed from the situation. That's one of the big takeaways from the book of Job. It's kind of like, as we'll see, Joseph in Egypt. He's at the bottom, in the prison cell. The author Moses gives us the reminder, God was with, God was with, God was with. And that's the same kind of thing that we see with this book as well. God's involvement in our suffering. Well, he is involved in our suffering. We'll talk more about that as we go. But I keep bringing up this guy, He's always representing the extreme. And this is, where the question of suffering, without the righteous part tagged to the front, why do the righteous suffer? But really, people in the world out there through the window are asking, why suffering, period? You Christians believe in a God who's responsible for this world, so why suffering? You get that question too. And from Richard Dawkins, let's get up off our knees. He's just kind of in our face, isn't he? Stop cringing before boogeymen and virtual fathers, face reality, and help science to do something constructive about human suffering. See, the solution for him, suffering is going to be taken care of by science. Science is the religion. Science is the Savior, right? We all know that, don't we? I know we're not smiling about it, but that's the common vantage point and perspective of a lot of people out there. That's why science is getting all the funding it does. That's why all the attention goes to science. Science is going to fix. Science is going to help. Science is going to alleviate. Science is going to improve things. Things are going to get better. All right. Now, yes.
I was going to comment at science background.
Yes.
When we talk to people of this nature,
yes.
Even coming as a Christian and seeing the connection between Christians, we have to be very careful when we talk about like science. I think if you want to make as a Christian capital S versus a lowercase s, we shouldn't, as a church, be against science.
No. Oh, okay.
The philosophy of this.
Yeah. This is
religious.
This is atheistic.
Yes.
Philosophy.
Right.
Behind the comments that he gives.
Sure.
Good point. Fair point. I would encourage Christians to become scientists as a means and being an extension of God's ability to use doctors, for example.
Natural revelation.
Yeah, to engage in the world to try to fix things and make things better. That's an expansion of the garden, by the way. I think that's our work as Christians, gifted with the image of God, bearing responsibility. So our pre-fall commands, fill, multiply, rule, and subdue, could be expressed if any of you are called to the vocation of being a scientist. So in your field, gaining knowledge of that field in such a way that as God's ambassador, going out there and working against the sinfulness and fallenness of humanity, in a way, expanding the garden. It's no different than what Adam and Eve were doing at the very beginning with their role. So yes, that's a good point. But here's his solution. I think the second quote, the total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. So what does he say about suffering? During the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive, running for their lives, whimpering with fear. So he's reflecting, being whisked away by parasites. Thousands of species are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. So he says his conclusion is the universe that we observe the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. So his answer to suffering is just run a little faster, get over it. There's not, he's not, and the book of Job, as we'll see, I think, gives an apologetical response, an apologetic against this kind of mentality. The book of Job is going to bring together our role as the righteous one who's suffering, God's role, but it's also going to unveil and lift the skirt a little bit with regards to what's going on underneath. And it's the role of Satan and his agenda as well that also contributes to the picture of suffering. So we'll talk about this as we move ahead. The big thing that we need to see in the book of Job is that it does not leave us without the answer to the question, is there moral value to our suffering? That's another big walk away. The answer is yes, there is moral value to our suffering. Our suffering, that is, the righteous who suffers. There's something valuable on the eternal plane with regards to our suffering that Richard Dawkins is never going to get a grip on with his, there's really no response that he would have. Suffering is just unfortunate. There's no moral value to suffering. It's something that science needs to conquer. And, that's okay, though. We've already talked about that. It's not a bad thing. But it's not the end of the story, because not everybody with cancer gets a cure. So the church's response is more comprehensive than that. And it's because of books like Job that gets us into the thinking that forces us to see, oh, God's role, my role, there's Satan's role. Here's how it all kind of fits together. And there is moral value to suffering. So we'll get into that. Here's some of the categories that are out there with regards to some of the big three philosophies. One, and I pull these from an author named Gregory Kukul. His book, Story of Reality, is really, really nice, and where he dives into these categories. We're at the top. They're the Godism. We're living in a reality where God's created reality for his divine purposes, and he's sovereign over it. And the problem of evil or suffering, in the midst of the reality which is fallen, good can come and ultimately will come. So there's a now, present, and future answer to the question of suffering that we have. And that's in the book of Job, as we'll get into. Matterism is a little bit of where Richard Dawkins would be. Matter is ultimate reality. So that drives the question with regards to suffering. No rhyme or reason to it, no justice, no purpose other than to advance the general gene pool. So that's the evolutionary idea. Purpose then can be invented, or if you are morally driven, you can be a doctor and find a cure to all evil. Not a bad thing, right? Not a bad thing, but not the full picture. Mindism is more of the Eastern idea. God is all, or you are God, little g God. Ultimately, then, you're responsible or to be blamed for all the bad that comes your way. So that gets into some of those Eastern ideas of karma, reincarnation, and some of those things. Yeah, don't have a lot of time to fully discuss that. So with option number one, with regards to evil and suffering, we see God is somehow and in some way then linked to the reality of suffering that's in the world. And we'll see that in the book of Job. Number two, there is no God at all linked to the reality of suffering in the world. That would be the atheistic idea. Or number three, you might be the God responsible for the reality of suffering in your world, So there's the big three differences with regards to the response to this question of suffering. So let's keep going here and get into the book of Job. So as I said, the book of Job's not going to leave us in the dark or hanging without the idea that there is moral value behind human suffering. Human suffering is not devoid of any meaning. And it's also, the book of Job will strip away the false notions of how someone might think or approach the issue of human suffering. Now, to the ancient mind, here's the idea. And this is a little bit of what the book of Job is dispelling in its context. You've heard this before. The gods reward the righteous and punish what? Punish the wicked. So that's the idea that the book of Job is going to dispel. And that idea, that notion's been around forever in the pagan world and the world outside of the church, or those who hold to the fact of God creating the universe. But that's why I say little g gods. But the book of Job is going to do a big this to that idea. And we'll see that where that comes into play. One of the things that you see right away that the book intentionally does, Job is going to be portrayed as one of these individuals. So this ought not be happening to him because he's here. So from the very beginning, we see that that's a problem for the common the common worldview. But how often do we run into people on the street, right through the window, who think this basic idea? The average Joe probably has this indwelling idea, well, bad things are happening to me, I must be a bad person, or something bad's happening to that person, so they must be part of the bad people. But if I want to be on the good side with the gods, then I have to be a good person to avoid any disaster or catastrophe in my life. And that's where a lot of people are these days. All right, well, let's keep going here. The basic organization of the book, it's a 42-chapter book, huge. The first part of it, it's going to be a combination of narrative prose and poetry, kind of a combo. The first part of the book starts with the narrative, kind of the history or the backdrop to the book, what happens to Job, how the problem of suffering is set up, and that's where you see the narrative part in the prologue, and then again in the epilogue, how the plot unwinds at the end. But the largest section, sectioned in between the two, narrative, prologue, and epilogue, is the poetic section, which basically encompasses a series of speeches, a back and forth between Job and his friends, his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And after these speeches are over, we have another of his friends that show up, named Elihu. He shows up. And then finally, the Lord himself has a chance to come in and lay down his speech. And then there's an exchange between Job and the Lord, and then there's the epilogue at the end. The thing is, Job is vindicated in a way in terms of how the conflict in his life gets resolved and how his situation is restored. So let's look at the prologue. Every good story begins with a good beginning, prologue. And we see that in the beginning, a couple chapters here is really what we're looking at here. But it's an important part of the book. To understand the book, you have to understand what's going on in these first two chapters. So we'll spend, obviously, a little more time on these first two chapters, and I'm not going to be able to cover every jot and tittle of the rest. But we'll get the beginning and the end is really what's the most important part. And it's interesting, the context for Job and the individual Job is set outside of the biblical context. He's portrayed as a patriarch, kind of like an Abraham-type person. He's not evaluated in any way through the Mosaic law, through the Torah. Like what we saw with Abraham, he's just allowed to be a righteous individual and being in relationship with the Lord, and that's it, plain Jane. There's no 10 commandments involved, right, in the book of Job. So that's what I mean, that it's set outside of the boundaries of Israel. So we're pre-Torah, not maybe so much from the vantage point of the author, but for the sake of what's going on in Job's life. What's interesting is that we have this reference in the book of Ezekiel, of all places. Let's turn there. In Ezekiel chapter 14. And if George is ready, Patrick. I'm sorry, Charles. I'm sorry, Charles. And let's go to Ezekiel chapter 14. What do we have here? Chapter 14, beginning in verse 12. Yeah, start reading there in verse 12 down through verse 14. See,
can
ready?
you hear me?
Yep. Oh, no. I can hear you.
Uh-oh.
You hear me? Go ahead. No, he's not playing through the...
Oh, okay. Something happened. It's fine.
Through my computer.
Okay.
It's been something the way it's set up. So.
Okay. Let's have Thomas. Oh, he left. Okay. Yeah. Oliinka, where are you? He left too. Okay. Oladende. There. You read for us. Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 12 through 14.
Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, if a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, and I stretch out my hand against it, destroy its supply of bread, send famine against it, and cut off from it both man and beast. Even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, by their own righteousness, they could only deliver themselves, declares the Lord God.
Okay, stop there. So there you have the reference to Noah. That's the Noah of the Bible. Genesis 6 through 8, Noah. And there's Job. He's mentioned as one of the Old Testament righteous individuals. And this reference to Daniel is probably, it's not the Daniel of the Old Testament. It's a Daniel that's not the Daniel of the exile, but he's an ancient Phoenician king. And he's also referenced in Ezekiel 28:3. So all three figures now from the prophet Ezekiel is being referred to as a righteous individual. So it's really interesting to connect, there again, Job with, in this case, Noah, who was also one, according to the Bible, was righteous before the Lord. That's why he was tapped on the shoulder for his unique job and role in that context. So kind of like you can think of Job as Noah. Think of a Noah-like person. Noah, because of his righteousness, was found by God and chosen and then used to build an ark to offer a means of establishing and extending grace and being a preacher of righteousness for that time period. But Job's now being selected by God for a different reason. He's being selected by God for a different, unique purpose, and that is to suffer, to experience suffering as an example for present and future audiences. So let's take a look at his situation. This is taken from what movie? Fiddler on the Roof. If I were a rich man. I love that movie. Okay. You don't want me to sing, I can tell. Okay, I'll move on. Job chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Let's have Joel over here read that for us. Got it?
Sir?
Chapter 1, verses 1 through 5.
Ezekiel?
No, Job. The book of Job. You need to phone a friend.
Okay. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, and 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all men of the east.
There were female donkeys, by the way. Okay, go. Keep going.
And his sons went and feasted in their houses, and on this day, and sent and called their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, in the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually.
Okay, so let's just pause there. So we have a little picture here of the household of Job. And here we have example of him being righteous, but also experiencing relationship and subsequently being blessed here by the Lord. Capital L-O-R-D, very specifically in the eyes of the author. And Job is righteous, he fears God, but he's not sinlessly perfect, but he's dealing with sin even in this particular context. So he's overseeing here a successful household. So Job is going to be, if you think of, I think of the book of Job as kind of an intersection between Genesis 3 and Genesis 22. So the book of Job, think of it this way. The scenario that we're going to see emerge right around the corner here is going to take us back in a way, back to Genesis 3, where we meet up with the devil, Satan, coming into a scenario with an agenda to destroy and to mess things up, to take down the name and the reputation of God in a very particular way, a challenge. So Job is like, in that situation, but he's also going to be like the Abraham of Genesis 22. where God's going to take that individual through a scenario, and there we have the idea of testing. Remember testing? Where Abraham's faith was tested through the sacrifice of his son Isaac in that whole scenario on Mount Moriah. And what was revealed through that scenario for Abraham was Abraham's what? His faith and his righteousness. He was declared as one who fears the Lord after that. Or that was confirmed. I mean, it was true before, but it was confirmed after that whole experience. So in a similar kind of way, you can interpret the book of Job through that same lens, right? Job is going to be tested. And it's going to involve Satan in this particular case, not too far different than the way it was for Adam and Eve. So you've got these kinds of themes coming in to the book of Job. So just like what we saw in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, but Satan, I mean, we just meet up. There he is. He just shows up. We have a similar case here in chapter 1, verse 6. So let's pick up that story here in, let's have Chris is not here. Okay. How about Michael right here? Could you read? Starting in verse 6 down through, what do we say, verse 12. Let's read yeah.
Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Our Lord said to Satan, From where do you come? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it.
No different than what he was doing outside of the garden, right? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Then the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. Then Satan answered the Lord.
You got to kind of read it with kind of a sinister tone. Put on your acting hat. I know your wife would probably be enjoying this right now. Yeah, she'd be hackling you. Okay, go ahead.
Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face. Then the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord.
Okay, so there's a couple components that we start to see come up. Satan is around. He's roaming around looking for things to disrupt. He shows up and he has this scenario. There's this guy. He's only praising God because you've given him everything he wants. He's only worshiping you, the Lord, because you've blessed him all of his life. He grew up in a Christian home. What if you let me after him? I mean, he'll curse you to his. If you take that away, Lord, will he still be worshiping you? Will he still be, a loyal and in a faithful, context of a relationship of covenant fidelity? What if all that gets disrupted? So you have Satan's agenda here to disrupt the divine agenda, destroying the image of God by killing humans, destroying their image-bearing capacities. These are all part of Satan's, agenda from the beginning. He wants to devalue humanity, the value of being human or being a human being. He wants to distract human beings from their experience of the fullness of life and the experience of the fullness of life. And then he wants to counterfeit all these kinds of spiritual options for humanity that promise meaning and fulfillment. So Satan's question is revealing. Does Job fear God just because he's been blessed? Or does the divine blessing on Job also include this protective hedge around Job in such a way that nothing bad could ever happen to Job and his household? Is that Satan saying, is that what's going on here? Is that what I see going on here, God? So this scenario comes in. And then we see the testing language start to come in here, beginning in verse 13. So let's see here. Let's move ahead. So this is where we start to see the idea from the ancient world up here start to break down. And for the ancient mind, the gods are going to reward the righteous but punish the wicked. And, part of then the book of Job is going to even address this question. Is Job thinking this too? Is he going to be challenged? Is this his theology? Is this what he personally holds? His worldview, is it this as well? Is this where Job comes from? And we're going to find out that as well. Does this define his relationship with the Lord? Is Job is he only worshiping the Lord because he's being blessed? We're going to find that out really quick. And what about the times when things are not going well for Job? How is he going to respond? What is the authentic relationship, the authentic, life of, in a relationship with God look like? What does it look like when times go bad or things go south? So that's what we have going on here. So what happens next comes as a bit of surprise. Here in verse 13, Satan, who's been allowed to roam around on earth, like Genesis 3, now is allowed to come in and test Job through suffering. God's going to test Job through suffering by allowing Satan some degree of freedom here in this scenario. So starting in verse 13. Now it happened on the day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, that a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, the donkeys feeding beside them, and then the Sabaeans attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So while he was still speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone am left who have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine at their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came from across the wilderness, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Phew, that's life, isn't it? Yeah. So we've got this testing here. It's important that we put a tent peg in right here. Job's testing is going to remain under the umbrella of God's rule and sovereignty. The Lord is involved in Job's suffering. I prefer the word testing, suffering through testing in Job's case. And I stay close to this testing idea because this is the word that comes in where we see, for example, Abraham was tested. Joseph was tested, I made the case. And we see this testing idea in terms of the nation of Israel in the wilderness experience. And its pushback that God allows, the harshness of the wilderness experience, was the means that God allowed to test, to refine, to authenticate, and reveal faith. And authenticity. What does it really look like underneath the hood? So that's kind of what we have going on here. And we see here in Job's situation, the fire of testing. Remember, it's that refining idea. The refining of gold is kind of the ancient idea behind it. Comes through, in this case, examples that come through the fallenness of the world. We have the fires coming through the fallenness of the world in combination with what we would call natural causes. Verse 15, we see death due to human conflict and sin. Verse 16, death due to a natural cause. Verse 16, in the reference there in that case, it's the fire that came, probably from some lightning strike or something like that. Verse 17, death due to human conflict, sin, and suffering, sin and conflict. And then the last one, verse 19, some kind of windstorm, or a tornado or something, again, due to natural causes. These are the kinds of things that create the fire in our lives, that create the testing experiences that we experience as part of the righteous. Some of them, though, push a little hard against us. And I remember the day when I got the phone call when I was maybe a junior in college. I don't know if I've shared this with you before, but my brother and a friend were kicking the soccer ball around in the front yard. There was not a cloud in the sky, except for one. And my brother remembers, looking up and actually making a comment about this black cloud that was up there. It wasn't a few seconds later that a lightning bolt came out of that cloud, struck the tree in my front yard where they were kicking the soccer ball back and forth. The lightning bolt then went underground and had a decision to make between right or left, and it chose to go towards Huey, my brother's friend, and he was electrocuted and died because of a lightning bolt from a stray black cloud. Not the only one in the sky on that day. Talk about odd and weird natural things that happen in a fallen world. But, like some of the questions that we've seen from the biblical authors before, how do you define meaning to life in this situation where you're in the midst of that kind of adversity, that kind of pushback? And this is where we're going with this book of Job. He's going to, interestingly, ask that same question. How did the father respond to that situation? Huey had a dad. His mom had passed away earlier. And my recollection of the scenario was that this was a Christian family. And Huey's dad used this as a testimony and shared Christ with people on the foundation of his own life experience, in the case here of losing his son. And he actually witnessed to my brother at a very, very formative time in his life. And my brother remembers, we talk about it today, how Mr. Huey's dad responded in that situation. How did he respond? So that's, those are the things that we're talking about here. Job almost loses everything in this particular scenario. And Satan's expecting Job to respond with a big fat curse. I curse you, God. I curse you. And how do we see Job respond in this situation? How does a righteous one, how does an Abraham-like individual respond to this situation? We see in verse 20, Job arose after hearing this news immediately. He tore his robe and he shaved his head, which is what you do when you are grieving, right? And he fell on the ground and he worshiped. Yeah, that's how Job responds. And he says, verse 21, here's a little bit of poetry. Maybe he wrote a song or sang this. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord Yahweh gave, and the Lord Yahweh has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And through all this, the author makes it very clear Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. So that's kind of shocking. That's revealing. That's one of the lessons that we get from this book. But interestingly, we have a round two with the three main characters, God, Job, and Satan. We have a round two, and the divine conversation continues. Again, one day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, Satan came. So it's the same group, right? The Lord asked Satan a very similar question. What are you doing here? That's verse 2. That's my quick translation. Satan says the same thing. I'm just roaming around looking for trouble. And then verse 3, the Lord says to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him in all the earth, blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. All that a man has, he will give for his life. So now Satan's turning up the volume on his, Walkman here. However, put forth thy hand now and touch his bone and flesh, and he'll surely curse you to your face, Lord. Verse 5, so the Lord says to Satan, behold, he's in your power, only spare his life. And so then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And the pain was so much, that's my own addition, he took a potsherd, Job did, to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. So Satan responds, let me take his health, let me impact something and cause him physical pain, and that will cause him to curse you. Because he certainly is going to start blaming you then. And the Lord says, I'll allow that. Just don't take his life. I don't know if any of you have ever witnessed long-term suffering for physical reasons, right? Anybody in your life, or maybe a grandma, grandpa. In my personal case, watching my mom struggle with cancer for 10 years. She was a cancer survivor for 10 years until it went into her soft tissue from her spine, and that was the end. That cancer, fast growing, no cure. And in the early days, when they didn't really know what to do with breast cancer, my mom was improperly diagnosed, and it unfortunately, what could have been saved then, the science of medicine hadn't advanced that far with how breast cancer is detected, especially detected early and then treated properly. So thankfully, science is here. This is a great example of how science has advanced the conversation on this kind of cancer. And there's a much better detection rate and cure rate, but unfortunately, so this is what happens, and you've probably had experiences like this with people in your church or even in your own family. And there's a little bit of a mystery here. Some people have a cure, some people get over cancer, some people survive cancer, and eventually it becomes, kind of dormant for a while and goes away even. Sometimes people experience healing for cancer, but not everybody. Not always the case. So Job, in this case, his testing intensifies. And that, this kind of intense testing has a way of clearing away the mud or the distractions. We've talked about this before. When Israel goes into the wilderness experience, all of their distractions are taken away. Their primary focus now is every day it's the same. Learning that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. It's trusting in the Lord for provision, for protection, for guidance, for direction. And it's that kind of a thing. We see that this kind of suffering, and we talked about God's involvement, right? God's involvement in suffering. And let me go back to the very beginning and just remind ourselves of where this all starts. I'm kind of laying a foundation. It might be helpful for you in your counseling ministries especially. But if we go back to where the problem got started and how God responds to Satan, from the very beginning in chapter 3, do you remember his curse against Satan? After the fall happened, after Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil or adversity, after that tree was taken, he says, because you have done this, Satan, cursed are you more than all cattle, more than every beast of the field, and on your belly you shall go. Dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. And by the way, Satan, from her seed one will come, who eventually will come to bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. So there's going to be some future suffering that's going to involve one who will come from the seed of woman. And we all knew who that is. We've already figured that out. And we saw that the suffering one, if you had me for prophets, we saw how the prophets expand on this idea, and especially the prophet Isaiah. And let's turn to Isaiah chapter 53. Isaiah builds on this idea of suffering, and the idea that one would come who would suffer on our behalf. And he identifies him as the suffering servant in this line. 53, we'll just read a little bit of it. Verses 5 down through 7. But he was pierced for our transgressions and our sins. He was crushed for our iniquities. That's the language that comes from Genesis. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that's led to the slaughter, and like sheep that is silent before its shears, so he did not open his mouth. He suffered on our behalf, right? So that suffering one, and the role and God's involvement in this kind of suffering. We turn to, let's see. And I build a case that, on this kind of suffering, if we go to the book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 8. There's kind of an eternal, heavenly dimension to this suffering. Chapter 13, verse 8. And John writes, "And all who dwell on earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation." Here's how I translate that. The prepositional phrase "from the foundation of the world," I move to the end of the sentence there, which I think is proper. Name has not been written in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain from the foundation of the world. So the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world, so that there's an eternal dimension to the one who suffered, who's now the cross represents that earthly expression of the suffering that we're seeing being described here. And this is kind of in wet concrete for me, so it might be an idea that gets refined in the future. But the Lamb slain from before the foundation of the world, the earthly expression of that is the cross. And there we see God's involvement with the suffering on our behalf. God's involvement in suffering. There's the mystery of the cross there. And what's interesting is that connection of suffering and our role in it becomes part of the New Testament conversation. Let's turn to Romans chapter 8 and make this case a little bit later on, but Romans chapter 8. If anyone around, Paul would have known a lot about righteous suffering, right? From his own personal experience. And oftentimes when we are counseling people about your situation in terms of suffering, Romans 8:28 is where we typically jump to, right? God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. But notice Paul has explained earlier in the chapter what the purpose is, what our purpose and our role is. So if we look at Romans chapter 8, he says in starting in verse 16, "The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirits that we are children of God." So he's talking about a family truth. What's true to be involved to being a child of God? Well, here's what he says. "And if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him." So when I say, and talk about the moral value of suffering, I'm going to passages like this. There's moral value to our suffering because it's attached to, we're identifying with the one who suffers on our behalf in such a way that, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with there's the moral value. Glory, right? That's to be revealed to us. And anxiously longing, creation waits for this revelation to take place in us. Right? The glory that's produced through our suffering. So there's the moral value. That's kind of the New Testament adding to the Old Testament. But there's a little bit of that comes through it through the book of Job. There's a similar passage that comes out of 1 Peter 5, 6 through 11, if you want to write that down and go look at it, which alludes to Job, seems to allude to Job. I think, let's take a look at it here. I think it might be helpful. So 1 Peter... Yeah. Let's have, let's see. Mark over here, would you read for us? 1 Peter chapter 5, 6 through 11.
6 through 11.
Yeah.
Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kind of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of grace, who has called you to this eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the dominion forever and ever. Amen.
That might be a good example of a New Testament commentary or reflection on big idea of the book of Job, I think, right there is that idea. And Peter is writing here to persecuted Christians. So the context in his days, for that book is he's making a similar kind of comment there, helping the saints understand what's the moral value to righteous suffering and glory that's produced through testing or the refinement of the saints. So from this vantage point, God has the last word, right, on suffering. And if our thesis is correct, what's interesting is that in the context of Job, by God allowing Satan to have some role, Satan is even producing glory for God. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Through causing, being part of the cause of Job's suffering. And it's because of Job's response through that fire, through that conflict, that adversity that Satan brings about, that this is the glory that goes to God, according to Paul. And it's kind of in wet cement for me, but it's just interesting.
I have a question.
Sure.
You know, when you look at the things that Job had to go through in one day, he had 4 bad news in one day. He lost everything he's got in one day. How would you put it in this perspective that in our today's world, if someone should go through what Job went through,
What would it look like today?
I don't think that person would still be normal.
Would be what?
Would be normal, as in would still be sane.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
you know, some people they receive some news and in the process they just passed out.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah.
So I'm looking at it that I don't think God should replicate this kind of thing in this.
Yeah, the comment was, for those at home, is, if there's some kind of scenario like this for Job in a modern context, how would a typical Christian respond, right? Would probably lose their mind or go into extreme depression or some other. It would be rough, absolutely. Very tough. I don't know if we could come close to matching this with some kind of scenario. I can think it'd be. I often wonder if the loss of a son or daughter as a parent would be extreme. That might be tough. Yeah.
You said that story about your brother and mother, his friend who got.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here. I can't understand how that daddy can tell people witness to the Lord that it took his son.
I don't think when I said witness for the Lord, he's not explaining the story that way. He's probably able to. People ask him, I heard that you lost your son, and it gives him an opportunity to share Christ, and how he's, how the Lord has allowed him to move through that scenario to get to a place where he can live sanely again. When you lose somebody like that, that's extremely tragic.
He went through that, and then
healed and grieved.
Tell witness.
Well, I think he immediately started to derive meaning out of that life situation in such a way that it was like Job. Pretty much. Yeah, according to my brother, which made and impacted him and others I've heard along the way.
Good example of 19th century guy, Horatio Spafford, wrote "It Is Well With My Soul." If you read his biography, it was recent, more than Job, but if you read his story, what happened to him. A successful American lawyer loses his kid, pneumonia, scarlet fever, wife dies on shipwreck.
It is well with my soul.
And he writes the song.
Yeah, that's another great example. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. But we see Job, he's going to have an encounter with his wife immediately after this, where she comes to him in verse 9. And, after he's scraping himself and he's in extreme pain, he's sitting in ashes. His wife says, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." But to be fair to her, she's grieving too, a loss. She's in a similar, they've just lost some of their kids. But the interesting response that Job gives, but he says to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women." And here's the question. We've heard it before. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? Or that's the idea of bad. The tree of good, the knowledge of good and adversity. Here's the tree all over again. We identify with Adam's sin, but we also identify with the tree that he ate from, the tree of the knowledge of good and adversity. It's our world where we live, and we can't have one without the other because it's part of the fallenness of the world around us. So that's the profound question. And here we see agreement with the author of Ecclesiastes, Solomon. We looked at that when we looked at Ecclesiastes 7, verse 13 and 14. It's the same question, right? And this is Job's question. And, this is the unique contribution that Christians have to the world that is kind of stuck in their worldview. We can say this as part of our apologetic. Well, by the way, about suffering, well, we accept good, but we can also praise and worship God even in the midst of adversity. And when we suffer, we still can worship God. How can that be? Wouldn't you be angry at God? Well, you can talk, have a conversation with people. And how the world responds to when bad things happen is then different. And the Christian response can be somewhat unique and radical in a way, you might say. Like my friend Huey's dad, radical response in terms of. So that's where Job really gets really real as an Old Testament book. It's going to, in a way, critique these other dominant worldviews out there in the world with the Godism worldview. And it's going to identify the moral value to suffering. And so in the midst of his suffering, we see the friends of Job show up. And in verse 11 through 13, now when Job's 3 friends heard all of this adversity that had come upon him, they each came one from his place. Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamathite. And they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. And what's interesting, I love this part of the first part of the narrative, is that when they come to him, they immediately get out all of their self-help books and start giving him advice right away, right? Now, what's the first thing that they did? It's probably the best thing that they do. Right there in verse 12. They lifted up their eyes at a distance. They did not even recognize him. They raised their voices and they wept. Each of them tore his clothes, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. Then they sat down on their ground with their good old friend Job for 7 days and 7 nights with no one speaking a word. They saw that his pain was very great. Probably a good strategy for grief counseling would be not to be so quick with our words. Right? Sometimes it's just the best thing to do is just to put a hand around and say nothing. Not to offer advice for sure. That's really the thing. We grieve with people. If we practically apply this, we can grieve with, cry with, and remain with, but say nothing. We don't have to feel the pressure to solve their situation. Huey's dad's situation, for example, is impossible to solve and figure out fully, but grieve with. We went to the funeral and, we supported the family and, we do those things. It's interesting, my brother-in-law is a doctor up in Fort Wayne, and his world is this. He deals with dialysis patients. Dialysis has got to be one of the hardest roles for a doctor to be in. And he's the one who goes into the dialysis situation for people who basically kidneys are failing, which is really a hard way to go. Because when your kidneys fail, your body's, everything starts to just, shut down. He's often in those situations so the family needs to be notified. Decisions have to be made. How much longer do you want this suffering to continue? That's his world. That's his question that he has to oftentimes ask the family and to the individual who's on dialysis, and then you get into hospice situations and all that. That's his world all the time. So he does education. He's out there teaching other doctors how to deal with the situation and to be pastoral. How do you handle that with family? And here's what he did once. When he starts his class, what he'll do is, come up to the lectern. Everything, the room's full of young doctors, and they're all expecting him to start waxing eloquently. And he sets them up and he says, okay, so you're in this situation. You're going into the waiting room, and you've just told the loved ones of the person that they've got a week to live. And what do you say next after they start to respond? Here's what he does. He goes silent for a whole 60 seconds, and it's like an eternity. The doctors think that he's going to say something like, well, here's what you say next. But Andy's point is, you say nothing. You don't have to say anything. You have to let them grieve. That's what you do. And by saying something, you are interrupting their grieving process, which is the most important for them thing to do, is grieve and come to the realization, here's the truth. Here's what's going to happen next. Now we've got to make life decisions about this situation. You've just informed us that our loved one in the other room is within days of dying. So that's tough to hear. But you don't start whacking, just close your mouth and be quiet. That was his point. But the uneasiness of saying nothing, it's hard for us because we want to say something. We want to fix it, right? That's our tendency when we're dealing with people who are going through suffering and hard times. So it's that human emotion, right? When we're grieving loss. And this is the universal expression because everybody on the planet's a human being. This is how we're wired. And this is grieving. Grieving is an emotion that is part of our hard wiring. So this is an important ministry tool that we can take into our ministries. And this would have been a practical book then for a nation that was grieving. I think of the book of Job and its value to the exiles, for example, who are in Babylon. I think this book would have been part of the corpus of wisdom material taken with them to Babylon. And here's a book that's helping deal with situation of grief. Here's a nation that's lost its national identity, its king, its temple, its land. We've talked about that before, right? They're grieving over there. So I think this book, like a book like Job, would have had a very practical value to a group who is wrestling with the idea. We're over here suffering. What's God doing while we're over here? Is he giving up on us? We've asked that question before. All right. What's interesting is, the book of Ecclesiastes, which I think probably comes from the book of the hand of Jeremiah, the book of Lamentations. Let's turn to Lamentations chapter 3. And I think the book of Lamentations coming from Jeremiah makes sense because the whole book of Lamentations was written with the intent of dealing with and helping minister to a group of people who have grieved loss. So we see this constant sorrow. Oh, we'll play a little bit of it. Soggy Bottom Boys there.
I've seen trouble.
Okay. Enough of that. Constant Sorrows. Yeah, it's a funny movie. But chapter 3 in Lamentations, you hear Jeremiah getting into the core of suffering and deriving meaning out of suffering. And then the remnant who are in exile, or the audience, I think, that we have here. He says, I am a man who has seen affliction. That's the song. Because of the rod of his wrath, he's driven me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. Surely against me he has turned his hand. Hear the honesty and the raw nerve in this. Repeatedly all the day. He has caused my flesh and my skin to waste away. He's broken my bones. He's besieged and encompassed me with bitterness and hardship. In dark places he's made me dwell. He's like a bear lying in wait, verse 10. Like a lion in secret places. He's turned aside my ways. He's torn me to pieces. He's made me desolate. He's bent his bow and he's set me as a target for the arrow. He made the arrows of his quiver to enter into my inward parts. I've become a laughingstock to all my people. Their mocking song all the day. He has filled me with bitterness. He's made me drunk with wormwood. He's broken my teeth with gravel. He's made me cower in the dust, and my soul has been rejected from peace. I've forgotten happiness. So I say, my strength has perished, and so has my hope from the Lord. Does that sound real? You can hear the person who's struggling with loss and grieving. But then there's this long pause Jeremiah breaks, and then we have verse 19. Remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. I love that picture of the soul, the remembering soul. See, how do you respond when you're in a situation like that? You've got a soul that remembers. You have a track record with God, life experience, situations where you've seen him come through and show himself in a real way. And you remember, the soul that remembers is one that remembers, I have experience with this God. He's not given up on me. He's not abandoned me. And that's exactly where Jeremiah goes. This I recall to mind, verse 21. Therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. It's like the hymn writer, right? The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I have hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. So you have the resolution there in the heart and mind of Jeremiah. He's the one writing this for his group back in exile in Babylon. And notice the same question shows up over in verse 38. Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that both good, and the word is adversity, go forth? It's interesting. It's the same place that we've left from the book of Job. So here's what we have to say about that. So this remembering soul I kind of talked about. Job demonstrates this remembering soul, I think, and Jeremiah is encouraging his faithful to do the same. So a soul that remembers is a soul that can declare the truth of verses 21 through 26. That's out of Lamentations chapter 3. So when you're in the midst of the storm, that's what the picture conveys. You have a soul that's remembering. That's kind of a helpful thing. A soul that's bowed down in worship and can declare in the storm. Verse 31 in Lamentations chapter 3. For the Lord will not reject forever. For if he causes grief, then he'll have compassion according to his abundant loving kindness. You know, that's the soul that remembers, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. But I want to put my question from from James chapter 5.
James chapter 5.
James chapter 5. Read through 11 to 12. It talks about the endurance of Job. But the question I want to ask is in verse 13.
Wait a minute, where are you? James?
Yeah, James chapter 5.
Okay. The endurance of Job, okay.
Yeah, so but verse 13, that's where I have my question from.
Okay, let's see.
It says,
it's been a while since I've looked at this.
Is anyone among you suffering? Then he must pray. You know, I want to ask a question that...
I should bring that into my discussion. I forgot about this part. You know, it seems like he's having a little bit of a reflection there on Job and how he responds. Is that your observation? Yeah.
An observation and also a question.
Uh-huh.
You know, the question is, how easy is it going to be to pray when you're going through suffering? You know?
Pray and worship.
You know, that's my question.
Yeah, well, that's where Scripture is challenging us. It kind of takes, the truth and honesty is I sometimes ask myself the question, would I respond this way if these kinds of things happen to me? You know, I don't know until I get there. I hope so. I hope I respond the right way. I'm just being honest, right? You know, but that's the challenge, isn't it? That's where Scripture comes and challenges us. Let me keep going here, and I'll let you out a little early here. I just want to finish Job. So that, you know, after all of this has happened, we've got so much that's happened in just, you know, here just a couple of chapters in Job. Then we have the dialogue that starts to come back and in from his friends. So chapter 3, verse 1, all the way up to chapter 31, long back and forth in speeches that we have between Job, these 3 rounds between Job and his friends. So Job is going to chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Now we're back in Job. I got to go back to Job now. We've got Job is going to lament. Job's going to finally, after this period of silence, open his mouth and curses the day of his birth. Job says, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night which was said, a boy is conceived. May that day be darkness. Let not God above care for it, nor light shine on it." It's kind of a real raw book sometimes with regards to that. And that seems kind of honest. And after this, the advice comes quickly from Job's friends. And their basic theme is this. The basic kernel of truth that comes from Job's 3 friends is basically this. God is just and rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. See, their advice is coming from this philosophy, this idea. Therefore, suffering is evidence of wrongdoing. Ergo, Job, you've done something wrong, and the remedy here is that you just need to identify what that is, sin, what sin is in your life, and confess it before God. That's what you need to do. God's obviously punishing you because you're a part of the wicked, and that's not what we've seen in Job's life. He's clearly identified as one who's righteous, not sinlessly perfect, but rightly oriented to God. So Eliphaz, for example, that's the basic advice. And after some kind of mystical experience, we see Eliphaz. Let's turn over to chapter 4, starting in verse 17. Can mankind God? Can a man be pure before his Maker? He puts no trust even in his servants, and against his angels he charges error. How much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed before the moth? Between morning and evening they are broken in pieces. Unobserved, they perish forever. Is not their tent cord plucked up within them? They die yet without wisdom. And his basic thesis doesn't really address Job's complaint. Eliphaz is saying, he's claiming that no human can claim to be righteous before God. But Job replies with honesty over in chapter 6, verse 24 through 30. Chapter 6, verse 24 through 30. Teach me, he says, Job says, and I'll be silent. Show me how I have erred. How painful are honest words, but what does your argument prove? Do you intend to reprove my words when the words of one in despair belong to the wind? You would even cast lots for the orphans and barter over your friend. Now please look at me and see if I lie to your face. So what's going on here? Job says, show me where I've erred, and I'll tell you. Tell me what I've done wrong. So we see this in chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, a little alignment here with the book of Ecclesiastes. Is not man forced to labor on earth, and are not his days like the days of a hired man? As a slave who pants for the shade, and as a hired man who eagerly awaits for his wages? So am I allotted months of vanity? Vanity of vanities, remember that? Nights of trouble are appointed me, when I lie down and say, when shall I arise? But the night continues, and I'm continually tossing until dawn. My flesh is clothed with worms and a crust of dirt. My skin hardens and runs. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and come to an end without hope. There's a little bit of a Ecclesiastes coming through here. Let's keep going here. So another vein of advice from Bildad. He's going to put a slightly different spin on Job's scenario. So if it's not you, Job, who's in error, then it's got to be someone in your family. Maybe your children were in error. Chapter 8, verses 2 through 10. Let's see. I'm going to have Jessica over here. Could you read for us? Chapter 8, verses 2 through 10.
How long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a great wind? Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children have sinned against him, he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression. If you will seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation. And though your beginning was small, your latter days will be very great. For inquire, please, of bygone ages, and consider what the fathers have searched out. For we are but of yesterday, and know nothing, for our days on earth are a shadow. Will they not teach you and tell you, in other words, out of their understanding?
Okay, so we see a little bit of there from Bildad. It's got to be one of your children, Job. But this continues on, and Job's going to respond in chapter 10 here, and in a little bit of the response, we see more openness and honesty coming from Job. Verse 1, I loathe my life, my own life. I'll give full vent to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I'll say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why thou dost contend with me. Is it right for thee indeed to oppress, to reject the labor of thy hands, and to look favorably on the schemes of the wicked? Hast thou eyes of flesh, or do you see as a man sees? So he's open and honest with his friends. He's open and honest before God. In response to Job, Zophar, we have another friend stepping in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. And he's going to offer a sharp rebuke against Job. Let's see. Brad, could you read the first 9 verses in chapter 11?
It says, Then Zophar the Naamathite replied, should this abundance of words go unanswered, and such a talker be acquitted? Should your babbling put others to silence so that you can keep on ridiculing with no one to humiliate you? You have said, my teaching is sound and I am pure in your sight. But if only God would speak and open his lips against you, he would show you the secrets of wisdom, for true wisdom has 2 sides. Know then that God has chosen to overlook some of your iniquity. Can you fathom the depths of God or discover the limits of the Almighty? They are higher than the heavens. What can you do? They are deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Their measure is longer than the earth and wider than the sea.
So God's wisdom, according to Zophar, is unlimited. Job's got no right to challenge God. So his suffering must be somehow linked to the evidence that God is somehow displeased with him. And Zophar's going to reiterate this with Job. You've just got to find something to confess. Verse 13, Zophar says, if you would direct your heart right, Job, and spread out your hand to him, and if iniquity is in your hand, put it far away. Do not let wickedness dwell in your tents. Then indeed you could lift up your face without moral defect, and you would be steadfast and not fear. For you would forget your trouble as waters that have passed by. You would remember it. So he just comes back to this, right? Got to find something, confess it, hold it out, put it in your hand before God. And this is where, and Job's going to respond. Let's see here. I'm kind of losing my place here. We probably need to wrap this up pretty soon here because I promised you to get out early today. So that's what I'm going to do.
As the slide is on the screen.
Yes, we're going to run with our britches on fire. We're not going to resolve fully the book of Job until next week. So how's that for a deal? Thanks for your attention. It's a hard book to get around, so I want to come back fresh next week and finish out Job, and then we're going to move on back to history books. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Finish out the semester.